The red warning lights flashed across Jack's face as he fought with the controls of his cargo ship. The meteor storm had come out of nowhere, tearing through his navigation systems like they were made of paper. Through the viewport, he could see the three suns of this alien world glaring down at him, their combined heat making the ship's cooling systems work overtime. Come on, he muttered, pulling back on the controls as the ship entered the atmosphere. The cargo hold behind him was filled with medical supplies meant for the outer colonies, but right now, all he cared about was landing in one piece. The ground rushed up to meet him, an endless sea of golden sand stretching as far as the eye could see. The impact threw him forward against his safety harness. Metal screamed against metal as the ship plowed through the sand, leaving a deep trench in its wake. When it finally stopped moving, Jack hung limp in his chair, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. He came to his senses slowly, the taste of copper in his mouth, and every muscle aching. The emergency systems were blaring, warning him about hull breaches and system failures. The air inside the cabin was already getting hot. The cooling systems had failed completely. Jack unstrapped himself and stumbled to the emergency locker. Inside, he found what he was looking for: a canteen of water, designed to last 3 days with careful rationing. His hand shook as he clipped it to his belt. The rest of the supplies weren't much: some emergency rations, a basic med kit, and a portable beacon. He activated the beacon immediately, its soft blue light blinking steadily. The cargo hold was a mess. Boxes had broken open, spilling their contents across the floor. Jack salvaged what he could, stuffing the most important medical supplies into a small bag. He knew the value of what he was leaving behind, but survival came first. The ship's computer was still working enough to give him one last readout. The outside temperature was hovering around 120 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. He sealed his jacket up to his neck, pulled the hood over his head, and wrapped a piece of cloth around his face. The airlock hissed as it opened, and a wave of hot air hit him like a physical force. The three suns blazed overhead, turning the world into a symphony of gold and heat. Jack checked his compass, but it was spinning wildly. Something about this planet's magnetic field made it useless. He looked back at his ship, now half buried in the sand. It would make a good landmark, but he couldn't stay there. The metal would heat up like an oven under these suns. He started walking, his boots sinking slightly into the sand with each step. The horizon wavered in the heat, playing tricks on his eyes. Every so often, he thought he saw buildings or trees, only for them to vanish as he got closer. His throat was already dry, but he resisted the urge to drink from his canteen. He'd seen enough desert survival situations to know that rationing water from the start was crucial. The wound above his eye had stopped bleeding, but the salt from his sweat made it sting. He kept walking, counting his steps to keep his mind focused. The beacon on his belt continued its steady blinking, sending out its signal into space. Someone would pick it up eventually. The shipping lanes weren't that far away. He just had to survive until then. After what felt like hours, Jack noticed something strange in the sand. At first, he thought it was another mirage, but as he got closer, he saw they were tracks, unlike anything he'd ever seen before. They were too precise to be natural, too regular to be made by wind or shifting sands. Something intelligent had passed this way, and recently. He looked up at the three suns, then back at the tracks. The smart thing would be to find shelter and wait for rescue. But shelter could be days away in any direction, and these tracks meant civilization. Civilization meant water, shade, and maybe even a communication system to call for help. Jack adjusted his pack, checked that his water canteen was secure, and started following the tracks. The suns beat down mercilessly as he walked, and somewhere in the distance, dark clouds were gathering. But they didn't look like rain clouds. They looked like something worse, something local. He needed to find shelter, and soon. He couldn't know then that his decision to follow those tracks would change not just his fate, but the relationship between two species forever. The tracks led Jack to a cluster of dome-shaped buildings rising from the sand like giant bubbles. Their surfaces shimmered with a metallic coating that seemed to push the heat away. As he got closer, he noticed something was wrong. The settlement was too quiet. No movement, no sounds, nothing but the whisper of sand against metal. He approached the nearest dome, noting the strange symbols etched into what appeared to be a door. The entrance was already open, sand beginning to drift inside. Jack's boots made hollow sounds against the metal floor as he stepped in, grateful for the shade. The temperature difference was immediate, at least 20 degrees cooler inside. The interior looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Strange objects were scattered across the floor, and floating screens still flickered with incomprehensible symbols. Jack was about to call out when he heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from deeper inside the structure, followed by what could only be described as a whimper. Following the sound, he moved through curved corridors until he reached what looked like a laboratory. The scene before him made him stop in his tracks. A young alien lay trapped beneath a fallen piece of equipment. Her skin was a pale blue that seemed to shimmer like the surface of a calm lake, and her large eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and hope. Around her were several transparent carriers, each containing small creatures that looked like a cross between earth hamsters and lizards. They were moving sluggishly, their scaled bodies pressed against the sides of their enclosures, making weak scratching motions. The alien girl tried to speak, her voice producing musical sounds that Jack couldn't understand. She gestured frantically between herself and the carriers, then pointed at the equipment pinning her down. The meaning was clear enough. She needed help. Jack approached slowly, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. The alien watched him carefully but didn't show any signs of panic as he examined the fallen equipment. It was heavy, but he could see that it hadn't crushed her. It had fallen in a way that created a small space, trapping rather than injuring her. He made lifting motions with his hands, then pointed to himself, then to her. She nodded, or made a movement that seemed like nodding. Jack braced himself and lifted. His muscles strained, and sweat poured down his face, but slowly the equipment moved. The alien girl quickly pulled herself free, wincing as she did so. Once safe, she immediately went to the carriers, making distressed sounds as she checked each one. She turned to Jack and made drinking motions, then pointed to the creatures. Through a series of gestures, she explained that the settlement's water recycler had broken down. She pointed to the dark clouds visible through a window, now much closer, and made sweeping motions with her arms. Jack understood. A storm was coming, and everyone had evacuated. But they hadn't been able to reach her in time, and these creatures needed water badly. He looked at the carriers more closely. There were 6 of them, each containing one of the strange little animals. They were beautiful in their own way, with iridescent scales and intelligent eyes, but they were clearly suffering from the heat and lack of water. The alien girl pressed some buttons on her wrist device, and a holographic image appeared. It showed a planet burning, and these creatures being rescued. More images followed, their numbers decreasing, until only these 6 remained. They weren't just pets, they were survivors, maybe the last of their kind. Jack touched the canteen at his belt. The weight of it seemed heavier now, more significant. He looked at the alien girl, who was still trying to communicate something about the storm. Her own skin looked dry, but her concern was entirely focused on the small creatures in their carriers. Through the window, he could see the storm approaching. It was massive now, a wall of dark sand that would soon engulf the settlement. The rescue beacon at his belt continued its steady blinking, but Jack knew that no one would be able to reach them until the storm passed. And by then, without water, these little creatures wouldn't survive. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. Jack reached for his canteen, and the alien girl's eyes followed his movement. He held it up, letting her see the water inside. Her expression changed to something he couldn't quite read. Alien faces were hard to understand, but he thought he saw hope there. He unscrewed the cap and took a small sip, just enough to wet his throat. The alien girl watched intently as he did this, then made more drinking motions while pointing at the carriers. Jack shook his head and pointed to himself, then to the water, trying to explain that he needed it to survive. The creatures in their carriers had grown even more sluggish. One of them was lying on its side, its scaled chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The alien girl pressed her hand against this carrier, making a soft, trilling sound that somehow conveyed more sadness than any human cry could have. She touched her wrist device again, and new images appeared in the air between them. This time, they showed the creatures in their natural habitat, a lush world with purple plants and crystal-clear streams. The images shifted to show cities rising, forests burning, rivers drying up. The creatures grew fewer and fewer, until only a small group remained. Jack watched as the final images showed the alien girl's people rescuing them, caring for them, trying to help them breed in special facilities. One of the creatures made a weak chirping sound, drawing their attention. It was trying to stand but kept falling over. The alien girl rushed to its carrier, her hands shaking as she checked some readings on its side. She looked at Jack, and her eyes were filled with tears. Apparently some things were universal across species. Jack ran his fingers over his canteen. He knew he didn't have enough water to save both himself and the creatures. The storm outside was growing stronger. He could hear the wind now, carrying sand that hissed against the dome's outer shell. By his count, it would be at least 2 days before anyone could reach them, maybe longer. The alien girl seemed to understand his dilemma. She shook her head and gestured for him to keep his water. She made walking motions with her fingers, then pointed to the storm, then to the creatures, trying to tell him that her people would return after the storm passed. But her drooping shoulders told a different story. They all knew it would be too late by then. Another creature collapsed in its carrier. The alien girl made a sound that could only be described as a sob. She pressed her hands against the carrier, watching helplessly as the small being inside struggled to breathe in the heat. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the desert outside, about how much water a human needed to survive 2 days in that heat, about how much water 6 small creatures might need to survive the same time, about the empty cargo ship half buried in the sand, filled with medical supplies that could have saved lives. He opened his eyes and held up his canteen. The alien girl looked at him, confused. He pointed to the carriers, then mimed pouring water. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously, pointing instead to him and making drinking motions. But Jack had made his decision. He moved to the first carrier and carefully poured a small amount of water into the drinking tube. The creature inside immediately perked up, moving toward the water with more energy than it had shown in hours. One by one, he shared his water among all 6 carriers, measuring carefully to make sure each creature got an equal share. The alien girl watched him with an expression he couldn't read, but her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned a darker blue. As he poured the last drops into the final carrier, she reached out and touched his arm. No translation was needed for that gesture. Outside, the storm began to howl, and Jack could feel his throat already growing dry. But when he looked at the creatures, now drinking and moving with renewed strength, he knew he had made the right choice. He just hoped he would live long enough to see these last survivors of a dead world have a chance at a new beginning. The storm raged outside the dome, its howling growing louder with each passing hour. Jack sat with his back against a wall, trying to ignore the dryness in his throat. The alien girl, who had been checking on the creatures, came and sat beside him. She held out something that looked like a food bar, its wrapper covered in strange symbols. Jack took it with a grateful nod. The bar tasted like dried fruit and nuts, though he was sure it wasn't either. It helped with his hunger but made his thirst worse. His tongue felt thick in his mouth, and his lips were starting to crack. The creatures were doing better now. They moved around their carriers with renewed energy, their scales gleaming under the dome's lights. One of them pressed its nose against the transparent wall of its carrier when the alien girl approached, making a chirping sound that reminded Jack of baby birds. She showed him more images from her device. This time, they were of laboratories and research stations. He watched as alien scientists worked with the creatures, studying them, trying to help them reproduce. The images showed eggs, carefully maintained in special chambers, but most of them failed to hatch. These 6 were the only ones who had survived to adulthood. Time passed slowly. Jack's emergency beacon continued its steady blinking, but the storm interference meant they had no way to know if anyone was receiving its signal. His head had started to ache, and dark spots danced at the edges of his vision when he moved too quickly. The alien girl tried to help him stay comfortable. She adjusted the dome's internal temperature as low as it would go, trying to reduce how much he sweat. She showed him how to sit in a way that used less energy and brought him more of the strange food bars. But they both knew that without water, these were just delaying the inevitable. She tried once to offer him a few drops of water she had collected from the creature's drinking tubes, but Jack firmly shook his head. The creatures needed every drop to survive until rescue came. The alien girl made a sound that might have been frustration, might have been admiration. It was hard to tell with the musical quality of her voice. As the hours passed, Jack drifted in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, he watched the creatures. They were fascinating little beings. Each one had slightly different colored scales, ranging from deep purple to bright green. They seemed intelligent too. They would follow movement outside their carriers and respond to the alien girl's voice with various chirps and trills. Sometimes, in his confused state, Jack thought he could understand what they were saying. Their chirps seemed to form patterns, like they were having conversations. He watched as 2 of them pressed their paws against the walls of their carriers, chirping back and forth. Were they talking about their dead world? About the strange human who had given them his water? About the storm that howled endlessly outside? The alien girl never left his side for long. She kept checking his pulse, her 3-fingered hand cool against his wrist. She showed him more images, trying to keep him focused, awake, present. There were pictures of her world, of great cities with spiral towers that reached into purple skies. Pictures of her people's ships, sleek vessels that sailed between the stars. Pictures of other rescued species, carefully preserved and protected. Jack's vision blurred more often now. His thoughts became jumbled, mixing memories of Earth with the alien images he'd seen. He thought about rainforests and deserts, about oceans and dried riverbeds, about species lost and species saved. He thought about how life always found a way to survive, if someone just cared enough to help it. The storm's howling had become a constant background noise, but now it seemed to be changing. The alien girl noticed it too. She went to a window, wiping away the sand that had collected there, and stared out into the darkness. Her body language changed. She seemed more alert, more hopeful. Through his haze of dehydration, Jack heard it too. There was a new sound mixing with the storm's roar, something mechanical, something getting closer. The alien girl rushed back to his side, touching his face to get his attention, pointing toward the ceiling. Her meaning was clear. Someone was coming. Jack tried to smile, but his cracked lips made it painful. He looked at the creatures one last time before the darkness took him. They were all watching him, their small faces pressed against their carriers, chirping a song he almost understood. The sounds grew louder. Engines fighting against the storm, the screech of landing gear on sand-covered metal. The alien girl ran to the dome's entrance chamber, her footsteps echoing through the corridors. Jack could barely keep his eyes open now, but he turned his head toward the sounds of multiple doors opening, of voices calling out in that musical alien language. Through his blurred vision, he saw tall figures entering the room. They wore protective suits that shimmered like oil on water, their helmets reflecting the dome's lights. The alien girl was speaking rapidly, gesturing toward Jack, and then to the creatures. One of the newcomers rushed to check the carriers while two others knelt beside Jack. Cool hands lifted his head, and something pressed against his neck with a soft hiss. Almost immediately, the fog in his mind began to clear a little. One of the aliens held up a container of clear liquid, not water, but something that glowed faintly blue. They made him drink it slowly, supporting his head. It tasted like mint and starlight, if starlight had a taste, and he could feel it spreading through his body, driving back the worst effects of dehydration. More aliens were entering the dome now, carrying equipment and speaking in quick, urgent tones. The alien girl hadn't left Jack's side, and now she was showing the others something on her wrist device. The images of him sharing his water with the creatures. The aliens watching the recording grew very still, their movements becoming more gentle as they tended to him. One of the creatures started chirping loudly, a high, trilling sound that the others quickly joined. It wasn't a distress call. It sounded almost like singing. The aliens all turned to look at the carriers, and Jack heard sounds of surprise in their musical voices. The creatures were pressing their paws against their carriers, all facing toward him, all making that strange, beautiful sound. The alien who seemed to be in charge removed their helmet, revealing features similar to the girl's but older, with deeper blue skin marked with patterns that might have been age or rank. They knelt beside Jack and placed a hand on his chest, then touched their own chest, then gestured to include everyone in the room. Even without words, the meaning was clear. They were all connected now, bound by what had happened here. More medical equipment was brought in, and Jack felt strength slowly returning to his body. The alien girl was helping to prepare the creatures for transport, carefully checking each carrier's life support systems. Each time she touched a carrier, the creature inside would chirp at her, then turn back to continue its song toward Jack. Through the dome's windows, Jack could see more ships landing outside. The storm was beginning to die down, its fury spent, letting the three suns peek through gaps in the clouds. The alien medics were preparing to move him, setting up what looked like a floating stretcher beside him. Before they helped him onto it, the alien leader made a gesture, and the others carefully brought each carrier close to Jack. One by one, the creatures pressed their small faces against their carriers' walls, looking at him with eyes that seemed to hold galaxies in their depths. Their singing had softened to a gentle purring sound. The alien girl touched each carrier and then touched Jack's hand, forming a connection between savior and saved. The leader spoke a few words, and one of the others translated them into different languages through a device. Finally, they tried English. "You gave your last water to save the last of their kind. Our people will not forget this." The translation was mechanical, but the emotion behind it was real. As they lifted Jack onto the stretcher, he saw the alien girl touch her wrist device one last time. A new recording began, not of a dying world or of careful preservation, but of this moment, of a human choosing to risk death to save 6 small lives, of creatures singing their gratitude in an alien tongue, of 2 species learning that compassion needed no translation. The last things Jack saw before they carried him out were the creatures, still watching him, still singing their strange and wonderful song. He didn't need to understand their language to know what they were saying. Some things went beyond words, beyond species, beyond the vast distances between stars. Some things were simply about life, and the choice to preserve it, no matter the cost. Jack woke up in a room that looked like it was made of flowing water. The walls rippled with soft blue light, and the air smelled like ocean spray. He was lying on a bed that adjusted to his every movement, keeping him perfectly comfortable. His throat no longer felt dry, and the horrible headache was gone. The alien girl was sitting nearby, working on her wrist device. When she saw he was awake, she made a happy trilling sound that brought several medical staff hurrying into the room. They checked his vital signs with instruments that hummed and glowed, nodding in approval at whatever they found. Through a large window, Jack could see he was in a city unlike anything on Earth. Spiral towers rose into a purple sky, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of light. Ships of all sizes moved between the buildings in orderly lines, their designs both beautiful and strange. The alien leader from the rescue came to visit, this time with a proper translation device. "You are in our main medical center." The device spoke in clear English. "You were severely dehydrated. We almost lost you twice during treatment. But you are strong, like your spirit." Jack tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy. "The creatures," he managed to say, his voice rough. "Are they?" The alien girl immediately held up her device, showing him a live feed from another room. All 6 creatures were in a large habitat now, not separate carriers. They were playing in shallow pools of water, their scales shimmering as they splashed each other. They looked healthy and energetic. "They are more than well," the translator device said as the leader spoke. "They are thriving. When they were brought here, our scientists discovered something extraordinary. The stress of their experience, followed by their recovery, triggered changes in their biology. They are now showing signs that they might be able to breed." The alien girl added something, her voice excited, and the translator continued. 3 of the females are displaying mating behavior for the first time since their rescue from their dying world. We believe there will be eggs within a month." Jack smiled, feeling tears in his eyes. The alien leader touched his hand gently, and the translator spoke again. "You gave up your water to save 6 lives, but you may have saved an entire species. Our people have been trying to prevent their extinction for years. Sometimes it seems hope requires a different perspective, a human perspective." Over the next few days, as Jack regained his strength, he learned more about where he was. The aliens called their city First Home, though the name lost something in translation. They were a species dedicated to preserving endangered life forms from across the galaxy. Their ships searched for creatures on dying worlds, trying to save what they could before it was too late. The alien girl, he learned, was a junior researcher who had been studying the creature's behavior patterns when the storm warning came. She visited him every day, showing him new pictures and videos of the creatures. They had become celebrities of sorts among her people. Their story, the story of a human sacrificing his last water to save them, had spread quickly. One morning, the alien girl brought him something special. It was a small clear crystal that seemed to hold galaxies inside it. When she touched it, it played back the sounds of the creatures singing. That strange, beautiful song they had made for him in the dome. She pressed it into his hand, and he understood it was a gift, a way to remember. The alien leader came again, this time with news about his crashed ship. They had recovered all the medical supplies, undamaged by the sand, and would ensure they reached their intended destination. But they had a different proposal for Jack. They wanted him to stay, to help them understand more about human perspectives on preservation and sacrifice. They believed his way of thinking could help them save more species. As Jack listened to the creature's song playing from the crystal, he looked out at the alien city with its beautiful spires and streams of flying ships. Somewhere in that city, 6 small beings who carried the hope of their species within them were playing in pools of water, safe and happy. Sometimes, he thought, the biggest changes in the universe started with the smallest acts of kindness. 5 years passed like a dream. Jack stood in the observation room of the breeding center, watching the creatures, now numbering over 50, play in their carefully maintained habitat. Their scales sparkled under lights designed to match the 3 suns of their original world, and their happy chirps filled the air with music. The alien girl, now head of the preservation project, stood beside him. They could speak to each other now, thanks to years of learning each other's languages. She had chosen a human name for official meetings with Earth representatives, Star. But to Jack, she would always be the brave young researcher he'd found in that dome. "The first ones still sing that song," she said softly, pointing to the original 6. They were easy to spot, slightly larger than their offspring, their scales a bit more vivid. Even now, whenever Jack visited, They would gather near the observation window and sing the same melody they had created during that desperate day in the storm. The breeding center had become famous across known space. It wasn't just because they had saved a species from extinction, though that was remarkable enough. It was because of what happened after, what their story had started. Humans and aliens began working together on preservation projects throughout the galaxy. Jack's simple act of sharing his water had shown both species something important, that sometimes the greatest scientific breakthroughs came not from technology or research, but from compassion and sacrifice. A movement caught Jack's attention. One of the younger creatures was teaching its own babies how to swim, chirping encouragement as they splashed in the shallow water. Their tiny scales caught the light like precious gems, creating ripples of color in the pool. "The Earth delegation is arriving tomorrow," Star reminded him, though she knew he hadn't forgotten. "They want to discuss expanding the program to include endangered Earth species." She smiled in the way her people smiled, with a slight shimmer of her skin. They specifically requested that the presentation include the water story. Jack touched the crystal he always wore around his neck, the one that played the creature's song. 5 years, and they still want to hear about that day in the dome. "Because it changed everything," Star said. "Before you crashed on our world, our people thought humans were—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Dangerous. We saw your wars, your divided nations, the damage to your own planet. We didn't understand you." Through the window, they watched as one of the original 6 creatures helped a baby that had gotten tired swimming, supporting it gently and guiding it to the shore. The baby chirped a thank you, and the elder responded with a soft trill. "But you showed us something else," Star continued. "You showed us the humans have an incredible capacity for sacrifice, for caring about life simply because it is life, not because it benefits you. You gave your water without knowing what these creatures were, without knowing if you would survive." Jack remembered that moment of decision, the weight of his water canteen, the sight of those small beings struggling to survive. "Any human would have done the same," he said. Star shook her head. "Perhaps, but you were the first to show us it was possible. Now look." She gestured to a wall covered in images, humans and aliens working together on a dozen worlds, saving endangered species, preserving habitats, finding new ways to protect life in all its forms. A soft chime sounded, indicating that the daily breeding center tour was about to begin. Soon, the observation room would be filled with visitors from dozens of worlds, all coming to see the creatures that had sparked an interstellar preservation movement. Before they left, Jack pressed his hand against the window. All 6 of the original creatures immediately came over, pressing their paws against the glass from their side. They began to sing, their voices joined by their children and grandchildren, until the entire habitat rang with their song. Star touched his shoulder gently. "You gave your last water to save them," she said, "and they gave us a whole new future in return." Jack smiled, listening to the song that had become a symbol of hope across the stars. Sometimes the smallest choice, made with the greatest compassion, could change the universe. All it took was one person willing to share their last drop of water with a stranger's dying pets, one moment of choosing kindness over survival, one simple act of seeing life as precious, no matter what form it took.